Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, August 30th, 2021. Time for another week, time for another show, time for all the things that it's, I don't know, usually time for on a Monday morning. Going back to work. Time to make the donuts if you are looking to sell donuts to people on Hawaii or something like that. I don't know. How long does it take to make donuts? No one ever really nailed that down, did they? I mean, you just said it was time to make the donuts, and we believed the media. I don't know. Now I've got something else to get riled up about. Okay, good morning, everybody. The Kagro in the Morning show is live now. It's time to do that. We know that. If you don't turn the volume up, well, if you haven't turned the volume up, screw you, you're an idiot. I don't know. Now you have turned the volume up, of course, and you heard that. Kigo X is coming with 20 strong men, yes, to give you an option. Listen to the show or be removed. I didn't actually listen to the quality of that gentleman's voice, but he's referring, of course, to video that went viral yesterday, but that I didn't really put aside because I was like, oh god, another one of these. But it's important. It's absolutely true. You should be paying attention to this thing. I might even have retweeted it at some point yesterday, which means it's in there somewhere. Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate. I love saying gubernatorial. It's fantastic. And I don't know his name, and maybe who cares, but maybe it's important. Here it is. Thanks to Ron Filipkowski for coverage of this and many other things. He's been He's been Ronnie on the spot with the video in the last couple of days. Pennsylvania GOP gubernatorial candidate, although he just says GOV candidate, much less fun. Steve Lynch, speaking somewhere, Pennsylvania, yesterday, I guess. Let's see. Says today. That was August 29th. Yeah. And, you know, there's video, and I guess we ought to listen to the tone of the guy's voice so we can make fun of him later. But at any rate, he says an important part here: forget going into these school boards with freaking data. You go into these school boards to remove them. I'm going in with 20 strong men, and I'm going to give them an option. They can leave or they can be removed, which is, of course, not that far removed from, well, A, Nazism, of course. B, something else that we saw over the weekend from the Taliban in Afghanistan. Happened to catch video somewhere. Well, here, I have a picture of it anyway. From Kian Sharifi, who notes in the video he includes here, with armed Taliban fighters standing behind him, the presenter of Afghan TV's Peace Studio political debate program says the Islamic Emirate, which is now the Taliban's preferred name, wants the public to, quote, cooperate with it and should not be afraid, which I'm sure they reinforced with the great optics of standing armed behind the television presenter, I assume, to shoot him if he were to say anything else. I don't really know. But compare that to what went on in Pennsylvania. There's a guy running for governor who I guess is being taken seriously. I mean, sometimes it's one thing to say a guy is a Pennsylvania Republican governor candidate, gubernatorial candidate, and another to say he stands a chance. There are lunatics who, you know, declare all the time and get crushed in the primary, get 2-3%. I don't know where he stands in all this. Who knows? Those of you from Pennsylvania might have a better idea, but yeah, you're not supposed to be able to do this. And I saw a lot of people saying they were reporting this as a pretty explicit threat and reporting it to the FBI, and it's not a bad idea, and I'd encourage you to do the same, particularly if you actually live in Pennsylvania. But you don't have to in order to make the referral and report it, at least, you know, if not the FBI, then report it to Twitter. You're not supposed to be able to do this. But as you know, Trump threw all the rules out the window, so I guess Republicans in general can do whatever they want. Okay, let's see. Other things that we probably ought to bring up for discussion. I know Greg Dworkin will be rounding up his stories and ready to comment on things. Here's something that occurred over the weekend. Lots of pandemic stories, and something I need to maybe address again, take another look at. But lots of discussion. Last week, I think we mentioned the case of, I don't know if we knew his name at the time, Caleb Wallace, a Texas anti-mask, anti-vaccine organizer, if you want to call it that, who styled himself a freedom defender. His group was the Freedom Defenders, and they organized all sorts of protests in Texas against all of those things. And, of course, what else would happen? He caught COVID and was gravely ill, and, of course, his wife, who allegedly was a bit more serious about things and wore a mask, et cetera, although she noted in her eventual GoFundMe page that she wore a mask, and that sometimes Caleb was so hard-headed about it. He teased me about it. He mocked her for wearing a mask. Anyway, she's alive. He's not. He eventually died. She, of course, has the GoFundMe page. Think what you want of that. It's not going to reflect on them very well. And I have a lot more to say about that perhaps at some point. But we also learned heading into the weekend that there was this U.S. Army veteran, twice deployed to Afghanistan, Daniel Wilkinson, who died as well, but he didn't have COVID. He had gallstones, and apparently it had, made him, septic, I guess, would that be the term for it? He had gallstone pancreatitis, which I guess happens if you have untreated gallstones and they're not passing, but it's treatable. And they were looking for a place to, in fact, offer him that treatment. I guess it requires some surgery, but also some recovery in an intensive care unit. And they were looking around for a hospital for him where they could offer him this treatment and follow-up care in the ICU. And there were no beds to be had. And they called all over the state. They called all over all neighboring states. The doctor I saw on TV actually put the story out on Facebook to try to get some attention so that somebody somewhere in even a faraway state could offer up a bed, but nothing doing. And as it turns out, Danny Wilkinson died of his gallstone pancreatitis, waiting for an ICU bed to open up. And it just so happens that it turns out that at the time there was an ICU bed that was being occupied by COVID denier and active resistor of all mitigation strategies, Caleb Wallace, in Texas. So you could put two and two together and say, well, Danny Wilkinson died waiting for Caleb Wallace to get out of that bed that he never believed he was going to need and insisted he wouldn't, and that the whole thing was a hoax, and it's kind of a direct thing, and I don't like it, and it's not good, and he should feel bad about that, and maybe his family should too. But it was pointed out to me by a fan of the show who tweets as Ondine _ MD, who I assume is an MD, and who says, and I think quite correctly, and I wasn't too happy to get it necessarily in the late at night, but saying, listen, I like and respect you, very regular listener of your wonderful show at Kagro in the morning, but this isn't a good framing. People make stupid choices, and they're still entitled to medical care, and that's true. If we only treated people who always made great choices, our hospitals would be empty. Well, I'm not certain that's necessarily true, but I get the point there. So well admonished there, and I think that's it. I don't know. I wouldn't have put it as framing necessarily, but it's probably, you don't know, of course, that this bed would have gone to Danny Wilkinson, and in all likelihood it wouldn't have gone to Danny Wilkinson, and even if it had, it might have been too late. There's lots of factors in all this. I was just wondering about this, and maybe we'll talk about it with Greg if I ever let him speak on this show today, but it did occur to me, it's been a long time, but you all remember when we were admonished to flatten the curve. My understanding is we were flattening the curve for Danny Wilkinson. The idea was to stay out of the hospital with COVID so that people who ended up with gallstone pancreatitis could get treated. If it didn't mean exactly this, then I don't know what it meant, and you can stop admonishing people to flatten the curve. Caleb Wallace not only refused to flatten the curve, he mocked people who tried to flatten the curve. He actively protested and tried to get in the way of people flattening the curve. I don't know whether his bed would have gone to Danny Wilkinson, but if there weren't Caleb Wallace's out there, there'd be a much better chance that Danny Wilkinson would have got a bed. You can't get out there and say, I'm going to spike the curve, and then walk away from the responsibility when not only you kill yourself, but you take Danny Wilkinson down with you. That's not right. That's not fair. I was saying last night, by all rights, if there were people terrible enough, they should be out there not giving to the GoFundMe page, but protesting at his funeral and saying, you killed Danny Wilkinson. But that stuff is the province of Westboro Baptist Church, and I don't know anybody terrible enough to do anything like that. Better off that we just let some steam off, take our lumps from Ondine, as I think is proper, and move on. And with that, Greg Dworkin, who's a doctor and probably agrees, is here to update us over the weekend news. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. So I suppose I can be fair and agree with both of you.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, you're right that the whole idea of flattening the curve is to make sure that people who otherwise need to get to the hospital can.
That's the idea.
And on the other hand, we can't be Donald Trump, who only wants to govern the red state and red population and his voters and could care less about everybody else. We can't be that. And I think that was one of the points that was being made. And we hate it when Republicans do it, and we can't be those people.
We can't. So a point well taken, and a point that I probably knew should have been well taken when I was miffed about it. So I shouldn't have been, and I apologize. And probably best to do that right off the bat. So, okay. We like and respect you, too.
That's fine. It's just, you have to remember that as an influencer.
Oh, no.
Right. You don't get paid by big bucks people to pretend to, be neutral about this and then talk about it. Like other, YouTube influencers do. Oh, I'm going to get paid to point this point of view or push this product. We don't do that. We have opinions. But, we have to think about who listens and what that means and how people will take what we say and then apply it. And we don't want it applied to, being mean to other people.
Yes.
I mean, if you're a doc and New Orleans doesn't have any power right now.
Yeah, that's worse.
The storm hit, and docs in ICUs, when they lose their generators, story about that this morning, and the nurses and the respiratory therapists at this particular point in time have to have forearms like Popeye because you manually have to ventilate the patients until you get power back.
Yes.
And if you're that committed to keeping your patient alive, you can't turn around and say, well, you decide that this one really doesn't deserve to, and then that one does. This one's a Democrat, that one's a Republican, this one isn't vaccinated, that one is. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. You save them all, at least if you can.
There are, and when you can't, there are triage decisions to get made. But she left plenty of room
and
for
one of those
us
things
to say,
shouldn't
all right, we're mad,
how you voted or whether you got vaccinated.
Yeah.
Now, what you can do, which I think is totally reasonable, is charge them more. Put on a unvaccinated surcharge and make you pay for it.
Yeah,
that's okay.
And I guess people are going to do that. And I mean, the shot was free. You did have the choice, and it's still there. You can go. But yes, I think in real life, like in a situation of one of these doctors, which I guess I've not been in. She, I guess, has. Yeah. But I imagine that if I really were there, I'd be like, I'm mad at that guy. But well, we treat him. That's what we do.
Well, every doctor in a hospital in the United States and around the world at this particular point in time is literally putting their life on the line because there's COVID in their hospital, and they're going in and doing their job anyway. And as Justice Putnam points out, when the wounded mass shooter is in the ER with the victims, the medical staff fight to save their life as hard as the victims. It's what they do. That's true. It's what they do.
I'm not
so,
that's us out here kicking
cans. It's worthwhile collecting
cursing at the wall.
Growing number of right-wing preachers and radio show hosts who have died of COVID because they refused to do the right thing, and just list it. And, you do your research.
Yeah,
you want to do research? Why don't you go research it? Go Google this. Spend an hour doing that instead of looking up ivermectin.
Oh, yes. Please do that. I noticed, by the way, also viral out there, not the virus, but ivermectin. Did you see the picture of I guess there was one feed store somewhere that said, listen, the ivermectin is for the horses. Please don't eat it. And from now on, ivermectin is only going to be sold to actual horse owners. You have to show a picture of you with your horse in order for me to sell you a tube of this stuff.
Right.
And that was kind of interesting. Sure, photo ID. Republicans love that.
Right. My old acquaintance, we're not close enough to call him a friend, but my old acquaintance, Rajiv Ankaya, who was the pandemic flu czar under Bush, back when 2009 flu hit, tweeted yesterday, the disinformation trifecta. No on vaccine, no on mask, yes on ivermectin. We fiercely defend our Second Amendment rights and then lay down our arms when COVID comes.
Yeah, I guess so.
And, the horrible part about it is that there are things that could be done that even the thinking pundits just keep de-emphasizing. And the unthinking governors do it, well, that's not fair. They're doing it deliberately. Okay. But you can't vaccinate your way out of this pandemic. You're going to have to also do non-pharmaceutical intervention. We know that. We know that you're in a better shape, but not virus-free if you get your vaccine. And the stuff that we speculated about when CDC first announced about third shots and boosters turns out to be pretty much supported by subsequent studies. That is to say, there's a two-track thing that public health messaging isn't being clear enough about. Okay. If you are vaccinated with a one-shot J&J or a two-shot, mRNA vaccine, you have a much less chance of going into the hospital and dying. Right. Most of the people, like 90% or more, who are in the hospital in the ICU, and in some cases, New York State data suggests, upwards of 95% or more, are going to be unvaccinated. So if you're vaccinated, you have a great chance of not getting that sick or winding up in the ICU or dying, and that's hugely important.
Good, we're going to need that.
After about 5 months, the full vaccine series in the United States doesn't protect you against getting infected. And so what seem to be rare breakthrough infections after the vaccine are actually going to turn out to be uncommon, but not that uncommon, and will become more common over time. That's why Israel is now considering 3 doses to be the series. You're not fully vaccinated unless you have 3 doses, and I think the 3rd dose is just starting now, today.
Damn it, we're all walking around saying we're fully vaccinated.
Right, and Israel's saying not until you get your 3rd dose. And the reason is you were,
Israel.
But if you, and this may be because of the time frame that you got the shots together. We talked about that last week or the week before. But the fact of the matter is that your antibodies will wane over 5 months or so, and a 3rd shot raises them if it's 5 to 8 months later. And CDC is reconsidering 8 months and maybe considering it 5 months based on that data. And the point is, the reason they're doing all of that isn't because your protection against being in the hospital drops. It's that the infection drops. Yes. Your chances of getting infected drops if you can get your 3rd booster. At least that's the hope. And so that's why they're doing it. And you might look at, some of the professionals, some of the epidemiologists, and some of the ID people who sometimes, are a little bit too ivory tower, in my view, look at this and clearly, correctly say the data doesn't suggest that hospitalization is waning. Why don't we wait on these shots and make sure everybody gets their first shots? That's true. But what people want, regular people, is not be infected. Yeah, they want to be able to get this vaccine approved for kids, vaccinate their kids, send their kids to school without being infected, and they want to be able to go to bars and not be infected. Yes, it's dumb to open to open the bars and close the schools when you should be opening the schools and closing the bars, but closing the bars means economic disruption, and people don't want that. We saw that during the 2020 election.
We need
when
more
you tried to close things down, and southern states said we need the money.
Yeah.
We have to live.
They need the
can't,
alcohol,
ivory tower stuff saying, I need this money. I need this paycheck. I live from paycheck to paycheck. And, you might turn around and say, and that's also because I don't trust my governor to get me this money because, they're crazy people.
Oh, yes.
They're going to give it to their wealthy friends and not to me. But for whatever reason, it's a very practical thing to look and say, I don't want to be infected, so I want this third shot.
All right.
And that's not anti-science. It's not pro-science. You can make an argument pro and con about whether that should be your focus, but that's okay. In an uncertain situation, it's all right to have different points of view on that. But it's also very reasonable to say, I get that people are getting sick and tired of wearing masks, even though they will, and they would rather be protected against infection. And so this is a way to give them protection against infection, given that other people aren't going to be doing what they're supposed to do, and therefore wind up in the ICU and karma. That's the karma admission, you could call it. But still, how do I protect myself and my family? I can't change the fact that, people are weird and they're not doing what they're supposed to do. You got this free, effective vaccine. You should be taking it. Owning the libs isn't worth dying for. But if that's your, that's your jam, fine, except that how does that protect my family? I'll protect my family by getting that third shot. And that's the situation that we're in right now. The ivermectin stuff is completely insane and has no explanation other than Jonestown cultism.
Yum.
Well, how could they take this
flavor.
horse paste? Well, you know what they took in Jonestown? They took Kool-Aid.
That was human.
Remember Drink the Kool-Aid?
Yes,
that's where that
sure,
comes from.
Of course. Now it's eat the horse paste.
Now it's eat the horse paste, but it's the same thing. No, we're doing it because we were told that. Because I don't want to do that. That would acknowledge that you are right, and that would make me look foolish all these months, and I can't do that. Yeah. I can't stand the idea of being embarrassed like that, of being shamed, especially guys. They hate shame, and therefore I'm going to do everything but. And if this other thing, this magic pill, this Laetrile, this other situation that I can do that will, work just as well, or at least work somewhat so that I don't have to do what you suggested, I'm going to do it. And that's what people are doing.
I guess so. I guess if there's anything guys love as much as they hate being shamed, it's like being the guy with the inside track and beating the system. You want to get the vaccine, but the vaccine's not available yet or hasn't been developed yet, or you can't have it because you're not over 80 years old or whatever it is.
Right. Avoid shame, be the insider, and at the same time, go back and reread that excellent thread we talked about the other day on the air about what happens when you're the con and how you psychologically avoid admitting that you did something wrong because, it's just too hard. So you'll do anything but. You'll defend the con to the end because otherwise, if I admit that I was conned, that makes me look bad.
Yeah. Well, that's not smart, right? Okay.
But that's that. That all gets wrapped into the ivermectin stuff, which is just totally insane, by the way.
Yeah.
Now, why did it even happen? I think it was Ben Jacobs. Maybe I could dig it up. I don't have that handy right now. Did a whole thread for NBC News. Or maybe it was Ben Collins, one of the Bens.
Oh, okay.
We had the Jonathan corner, now we have the Ben corner.
Right.
So somebody did a whole series about how ivermectin in a preprint showed some antiviral activity, but neglected to point out that you have to give 150 times the dose, that's a normal dose, in order to get that effect. And if humans take it about 10 times, 12 times the dose, they'll go into coma. So,
well, where are they
some
finding
things
this
work.
antiviral?
They only work in mice, and they only work if you use 1,000 times the dose that a human would take. And so you can't take that information and say, that means. And then a group of crazy docs started to promote this, only a handful, who were otherwise cranks. I have my own theory about that. I think as some of these older docs, start to realize that their younger colleagues are doing things that they don't do anymore. They have to be the iconoclast and curmudgeon and try to make sure that everybody pays attention to them. So they all turn into Mickey Cows. And they all start saying and doing stupid things, but at least pay attention to me. I'm just asking questions. Then they form their own groups, like the ophthalmology group that certified Rand Paul. And, they're crazy people. And then non-crazy people look at them and say, this is insane. And lay people say, a doctor says it. You see, you have this group of doctors here who say this, but the rest of the world says that. I'm going with the small group here because obviously I want to be one of those insiders you talked about.
Yeah.
We see it in chronic Lyme disease when you go to Lyme literate doctors We see this in anti-vaxxers when they go to their preferred doc who can somehow write them a script, getting them out of the vaccine required for school. And we're seeing it with ivermectin. I mean, it's the same thing over and over and over and over again. Seen it before, and, we'll see it again. But, I don't know how often we have to reinvent the wheel to realize this stuff happens. And that's why it's so important to be firm and clear in your messaging about this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and there's things we don't know. This is what we don't know, but this is nonetheless, given the information, why we're suggesting this. We don't know everything about the proper sequence of events for when you most get protected by taking your vaccine. 6 to 8 weeks between your first and second dose, 5 to 8 months between your second and third dose. We don't know that yet, but our best information is this, and this is why we're doing it. And to do the controlled experiment would be unethical at this point. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So this is what we're saying.
All right. I think that's a reasonable approach to things. But yeah, you always want to leave room for, and in explaining why you are saying things, that leaves room for later saying, this thing has changed, or we know more about it, and it appears that this is true that we didn't think was true, or didn't know about at the time, and therefore we're changing things, and it's not because we didn't know what we were doing the first time, or it was a wild guess, but because it was the best information available. Now there's even better information available, and that's okay, and we're only trying to help you.
All right, having fixed the pandemic, we'll do Afghanistan after the break.
Okay, very good. We'll get on to that afterwards. Plenty of other things to round up.
Thank you for acknowledging that set of tweets you got last night.
Yeah, well, I think it's only fair to do so, and I don't know if at any point in any of that I ever said, I apologize for being curt about it on Dean. So there it is. I do actually apologize about that. It's a good point that she made, and I wanted to bring it up on the radio show where she might hear it.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue on. There's more than just a pandemic out there.
Yeah, we got a hurricane. Let's move to that just quickly because we don't really have a lot of information. But this is Richard Fawcett, who is New York Times, identifies himself as New York Times South. Good morning from a pitch black New Orleans.
New Orleans.
City official tells me NOLA reports of significant flooding.
Yes.
No reports.
Oh, what?
No reports in NOLA. No reports of significant flooding, loss of life, or disastrous structure damage, at least not yet. And that applies only to New Orleans. Other parts of the state likely hit hard. NOLA is still assessing, but no reports in NOLA of significant flood. In other words, it's not like, as soon as they were able to get out and look around, they saw that the levees have completely burst and the city is like 9 feet underwater. That's not the report out of New Orleans. That's good news. In the midst of bad news, but it's preliminary, and things may well change as we get more information.
They had no power for the longest time.
They had no power, and that's why the docks were using their Popeye 4 arms.
Yes, okay, thank you for
not 6 arms, not 8 arms, but 4 arms.
I've puzzled over that for a little while, but then I figured it
out. But, look at a picture of Popeye, you'll see what we're talking about. I don't know if they have anchors tattooed, but, that's the deal.
All right. Well, yeah, they managed to get through it, but not only did they lose power, everything, literally the whole city lost power because I understand the main transmission line that was suspended by a large tower alongside the Mississippi River. Tower fell into the river. So
one time, way in my past, I remember giving a panel discussion. I was part of a panel, and the panel was talking about the crisis that was and the crisis to be. And the crisis that was Katrina, and how some of the hospitals had to cope with Katrina at the time.
Yes.
And there was a nurse from one of the hospitals that lost power. And my part of the panel was preparing for a pandemic, and that was going to be the crisis to come. And my part of the panel isn't important for this discussion, but the nurse who was describing just how horrible it is when your hospital loses power was talking about lessons learned. Mm-hmm. And one of the lessons that struck with me is that if you're personally, individually preparing for something like a hurricane to hit your hospital where you might lose power for a period of time, and you're stocking up on things that you need, it's going to be food, water. It's the old, Connecticut blizzard. Everybody goes out and buys bread and eggs and milk because you make French toast when you're, got nothing else to do.
Is great.
But in a situation like Katrina, the nurse said, the one thing I wished I had known, lessons learned before this happened, is you need underwear.
Oh.
You can never prepare enough underwear because when you're on day 9,
oh wow, yeah,
you really want to feel human, and so nobody's going to tell you this, but in your kit of things to prepare for a hurricane, make sure you have enough underwear.
That really is. Yeah. Well, now you've been told, right? And it wouldn't necessarily occur to you. Can't eat it. Can't burn it. Can't. But still, right? Or doesn't require electricity.
Sometimes when you're out of stuff, you can hit the hospital stock of things.
Yeah,
ask any pediatric resident who's been on for 36 hours and there's no milk. Well, let me see if this baby formula will substitute. Anything in a pinch, right?
Yes.
But you can't. You can use hospital Band-Aids. There's no such thing as hospital underwear. You can't go into the hospital underwear stock and start raiding it.
Right, true. Even duct tape, which fixes everything, I've definitely not recommended. Even if you turn it inside out, honestly, just ban underwear.
Yeah, it goes on easier than it comes off. But, I'm just saying. So, these are the things that you learn. Yeah. But let's talk about a bigger issue that's going on here. I have a series of articles I saw this morning, which is kind of interesting because it seems to me that as we start to wind down, basically Kabul airport is now closed for people coming in. And the rest of today and tomorrow is going to be getting out the people who are already there.
All right.
Right. We know about, of course, the horrendous suicide bomber that killed 13 people.
Yes.
Who were U.S. armed services and many more people who are Afghans.
Right.
Right. Not Afghanis. Yes. Afghani is the currency.
Yes.
Afghans are the people.
Right.
But,
true.
It's despite all the jingoism, forget about all of them. You have to do Americans. Still 122,000 people have been evacuated since the evacuation started. Okay, remember, we couldn't do 50. That's impossible. We did 122,000.
Still true.
And, the stories are moving from hysteria that, oh, my gosh, how could this happen to America, to, okay, here's the heroism. This is what's going on. After that suicide bomber, U.S. drones in a so-called surgical strike took out a vehicle that was supposedly filled with explosives. Obviously, it was collateral damage. As somebody pointed out, it was Tom Clancy who said there's no such thing as a surgical strike. Doctors don't use bombs for surgery.
Oh, yes, right, true. Although they're getting closer.
So there was loss of life, certainly civilians. But there was that. And then there was a rocket attack on the airport. But apparently the U.S. was prepared for that and had anti-rocket stuff, so you don't hear about that so much. So Biden had, as far as I know, 2 retaliatory things that they did. One was finding the planner, or so they say. The other was the vehicle that was blown up on the way to the airport to try to do another suicide bombing. And then the third event was the blocking of the missiles. So 3 attempted attacks, 2 were thwarted. You don't hear about those. Obviously, you hear about the one that got through because that's the deal with asymmetric warfare. You can stop 35 terrorist things, and if a 36th gets through, that is going to be what you're going to be talking about.
Yes,
that's just how it works.
Will call for your resignation.
So Politico has Pentagon prepared for mass casualty attack at Kabul airport hours before explosion. Detailed notes of 3 classified calls. U.S. is very upset that classified calls are now being leaked to Politico. So whenever that happens, it's like, what's going on here? This story is based on the unlawful disclosure of classified information and internal deliberations of a sensitive nature, Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said. As soon as we became aware of the material divulged to the reporter, we engaged Politico at the highest levels to prevent the publication of information that would put our troops and our operations at the airport at greater risk. And, of course, Politico couldn't wait 48 hours until everybody left before they did this. We condemn the unlawful disclosure of classified information and oppose the publication of a story based on it while a dangerous operation is ongoing. And the ongoing operation is, in fact, trying to get everybody out. So for a little perspective there, this is Jennifer Rubin writing in the Washington Post. The State Department deserves more credit for its effort to evacuate Americans from Afghanistan. First, state had to imagine a universe of as many as 15,000 Americans, those who at any time over the years voluntarily registered with the State Department, though it anticipated the real number of Americans was far smaller. State pointed out that not all Americans register or deregister, and not everybody wants to leave, as we now found out. I would add. While the State Department has been criticized for not beginning mass evacuations of Afghans months ago, which in all likelihood would have triggered an earlier collapse as far back as April, it began sending one notice after another containing dire warnings to Americans imploring them to consider the coming pullout. U.S. citizens wishing to depart Afghanistan should leave as soon as possible on available commercial flights. And by the way, we talked about this last week. Commercial flights have resumed.
Okay.
A State Department communication warned on April 27th. The commercial flights are now starting to resume in Afghanistan. So the Kabul airport military side is not the only way out.
Okay.
Many Americans ignored these warnings. When the Afghan government did collapse, evacuation efforts switched into high gear, went global. In a 24/7 push, approximately 500 State Department consular offices, not only in Kabul but also around the world, began the excruciating process of going through the thousands of names of Americans who could be in Afghanistan. Mexico City, New Delhi, everybody else was doing their part. The State Department also heard from retirees willing to help. Round after round of calls, emails, and texts with public messaging for Americans to identify themselves. State narrowed the list of Americans still in country to about 6,000. And despite the logistical nightmare of reaching Kabul's international airport and the challenge of organizing an airlift, which at the operation's peak, a plane was taking off every 45 minutes or less, by midweek, the number of Americans in Afghanistan was reduced to 900. And by Sunday, about 300 left who have indicated us they want to leave. And by Sunday afternoon, the number closer to 250.
Okay.
So that was an amazing logistical job. And that's what the Marines and one airman and one soldier lost their life trying to protect.
Yes. Right. Well, it is that is a large operation also. Yeah, that too. A criticism over the weekend, Republicans saying, can you believe the State Department doesn't even have a clear idea of how many Americans are there?
Yeah, that was funny because, authoritarian governments know who's where.
Right, exactly.
The Chinese know where their people are here.
Right. Governments that inject their people with microchips, if there was such a government, would know where they are. But
exactly, and that was my point. If you really feel that way, just take the damn vaccine. It's filled with microchips, and then we'll know how many Americans are in Afghanistan. And if you don't want to do that, shut up and get out.
Right. Now you're going to be banned from Facebook for saying that, apparently.
Yeah. Well, apparently. Well, I'm not on Facebook, so they can't ban me. Well, but, really, if that's your worry, just take the vaccine.
They've already banned you, haven't they? Yeah, right. I mean, I guess there's no problem with that. But, there's not going to be any place where the State Department has an exact idea of how many Americans are anywhere, unless they come and tell them.
Right. So this is a paywall piece, and so you're not likely to read it. And Americans aren't. It's from Haaretz. But I thought it was pretty interesting, so I will give you this. By Yair Golan, who wrote this because somebody else on the opinion page said, "Oh, this is all terrible. It's we should never have pulled out of Vietnam. And Israel never should have pulled out of anywhere, including Lebanon and the Golan, and nobody should ever pull out of anything."
Okay, sure. seems odd. But
Yair Golan writes, Biden is right to leave Afghanistan, and Israel was right to pull out from Gaza. According to a recent op-ed in Haaretz, withdrawals are evil, and withdrawal in the face of Islamic extremism is the embodiment of evil. And in the process, he comes down on the Americans and their President Joe Biden, and of course those who supported the withdrawals from Lebanon and Gaza Strip, which, by the way, were very popular in Israel. Everybody, left and right, supported those withdrawals. According to this particular op-ed person, the Americans should have stayed in Afghanistan. This despite 20 years of fighting and rehab efforts, more than 3,600 deaths among NATO forces, mostly Americans, nearly 4,400 subcontractors, aid workers, and journalists killed, a much larger number of wounded, disabled, and emotionally crippled, countless bereaved families, direct costs of $1 trillion, and a sharp rise in the national debt. This will cost about $6.5 trillion by 2050. Despite all this, the author believes the U.S. should have stayed in Afghanistan. Now, it's been said in these parts that a stone that one fool throws into a well, 1,000 wise men cannot remove.
Okay.
The elder George Bush knew how to get into Iraq and come out. No, he didn't topple Saddam Hussein, but he did weaken him. And most of all, he avoided a presumptuous and unnecessary U.S. military engagement. With the end of Gulf War, it was clear to all who was the world's only superpower. His son, George W. Bush, didn't learn from this. He went into Afghanistan and remained. Thus was born 20 years of ongoing failure with no chance of success. That's the story of America and Afghanistan and Iraq. Anybody looking for the Israeli lesson ought to recall the failed Lebanon escapade. And so it goes on about a little more about Israeli politics. But his point is exaggerated pretenses, ignoring the basic demographic political conditions, and fear of making tough decisions. Those are the political ills that have unnecessarily entangled the U.S. as well as Israel. The discussion regarding the number of settlers in Judea and Samaria is fruitless and superfluous. In Judea and Samaria, there are 2.6 million Palestinians and fewer than 500,000 Jews. The annexation of such a large Palestinian population is an act of national suicide. That we have perpetuated this folly for over 50 years doesn't turn stupidity into wisdom. The correct debate is not just over the security challenges, but the national interest. And so I'm not focusing on the Israeli politics side of that. It's just that sometimes you need somebody from abroad to take a clear-eyed view of what we're doing. And, you got to remember that if you're going to criticize Biden for the fact that soldiers die in a war, then you better start with this thing called PNAC.
Oh, yes.
Right?
I remember them.
For a New American Century?
Project for a New American Century. Yes.
The Wolfowitz project that got us stuck in Afghanistan in the first place.
Yeah.
Which was then perpetuated and made worse, of course, by Donald Trump and the Doha Agreement and his screwing everything up and blocking special emergency visas in State Department and elsewhere through Stephen Miller. And then the withdrawal, its logistical headaches, the difficulty in pulling off what was pulled off, and the unfortunate and tragic suicide bomber, as well as the ones that were prevented. It's all part and parcel of the same piece. And if you think all of that is Joe Biden, you're politically motivated and nobody should listen to you.
Probably true. Or just, I don't know, born yesterday?
Crazy. Right. No, and that doesn't have to be an apologia for Biden. There's obviously things that could have been done differently, yes, but just like with the pandemic, this is honesty and transparency about what we could and couldn't have done. We have to look back and see how we screwed up. We were slow in this area. We were fast in the other. But people who want absolute certainty, there should be one way, and we should all know it now, are people who've never actually done this for a living.
I guess.
If you're so smart, would you have remembered that the thing that you really need is underwear?
Ah, yeah. Well, now you would. But, right.
But only after the fact and only after you learn, and that's how it's done.
There was no organized, peaceful way out of any war. Certainly not especially a civil war. And, and not Afghanistan in particular, right? They lack the infrastructure for it. So, I don't know. I'm not certain why. I am certain why. You were right. Politically motivated is the reason why people would do these things, and
Right. Here's another look at it. And again, you have people in the foreign policy establishment, otherwise known as the blob, who are trying to defend 20 years of being wrong. And that's all over the place. This one's interesting, though. It's from Dennis Ross, counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Dennis Ross has been an envoy in various and sundry places. And he writes a guest essay in the New York Times that says, "Stop the doomsaying. U.S. credibility will weather Afghanistan."
Okay.
Okay. And then before we draw definitive conclusions, a little perspective is in order. And again, if you're going to talk about the last 2 weeks in Afghanistan, having not talked about the last 2 years in Afghanistan or the last 20 years in Afghanistan, Dennis Ross reminds us of this. Before we draw definitive conclusions, a little perspective is in order. Vietnam, cited so often in recent days, was undoubtedly a debacle, but it didn't spell the end of American leadership in the world stage, nor did it lead others to believe they couldn't depend on the U.S. And since then, there have been many other geopolitical challenges and top-level decisions, or lack thereof, that have cast doubt on American credibility. They did not lead to a waning of American influence. During the Carter administration, the Iran hostage crisis, marked by a failed rescue mission, dragged on for more than a year as the rest of the world witnessed American impotence. Following the loss of 241 Marines in the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, Reagan vowed to make the perpetrators pay. Within a few months, Mr. Reagan withdrew from Lebanon. The U.S. never retaliated. During the Clinton administration, terrorists bombed the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, killing 19 U.S. airmen. Tough talk and access to information that implicated Iran, but the U.S. didn't retaliate either. President George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq are a story unto themselves. The invasion lacked legitimate justification. There never were any weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. also failed to sufficiently fill the leadership vacuum following the removal of Saddam Hussein, contributing to a sectarian conflict and the subsequent creation of ISIS. Congratulations, W. That's your legacy. President Barack Obama drew a red line on the use of chemical weapons in Syria and failed to react militarily when chemical weapons were in fact used. And with President Trump, the examples are almost too numerous to mention. A choice to, TWO, include frequent threats to pull out of NATO and an impulsive decision to withdraw from Syria. That was walked back by his advisors.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
The choice two, where pulling out of NATO and pulling out of Syria, advisors talked Trump out of doing both of those things, but each of those examples damaged American credibility worldwide, not necessarily to the same extent, but countries continue to ask for and offer support. So despite the messy exit from Kabul and the devastating bombings, Afghanistan will be no different. Partners and allies will publicly decry American decisions for some time as they continue to rely on the U.S. economy and the U.S. military. The reality will remain. America is the most powerful country in the world, and its allies will need its help to combat direct threats, an array of new growing national security dangers, including cyber war and climate change. And I would add, because this leaves it out because he's a diplomat, European countries remain very fearful of immigration. They have their own right-wing parties to deal with, including Germany, which has an election coming up. And so they're going to be very circumspect about saying, oh, this is great. We can just take in some more of these immigrants because I have an election, and that'll play really well.
Yeah. Well, not most places. Okay. Well, boy. Lot happening. A lot of moving parts to this. I think, this is a good roundup of differing perspectives, and it's nice that finally it does seem like the at least the foundation of the dominant narrative is beginning to crack. And and a lot of the hysteria from the media is dropping off a little bit too, and the fact that you got a hurricane to cover, that helps,
and a pandemic to cover means you're going to shift your focus because they can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
Oh, well, all right. Then it's not that helpful. But it does change. It does change perspective a little bit, and helps you realize, I guess, that all the focus can't be on saying, I would have done this whole thing differently.
Right. So David Rothkopf, who's written the same thing, we did one of his tweet storms last week, now is in the Atlantic writing. Despite the criticism, Biden, who's argued unsuccessfully when he was Barack Obama's vice president to seriously reduce America's presence in Afghanistan, remained resolute rather than view the heartbreaking scenes in Afghanistan in a political light as his opponents did. And I don't think they're getting a lot of traction on that. Biden effectively said, politics be damned, we're going to do what's right, and ordered his team to stick with the deadline and find a way to make the best of the difficult situation in Kabul. Now, there's no question Biden's taking a hit in the polls over this, although the hit might be even bigger for not getting the pandemic totally under control. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the problem for his opponents is they don't know what to do, and they're totally split on what to do with Afghan immigrants and refugees, which they said was at the heart of their criticism. Okay, yes. Well, then what are you going to do with the refugees? Well, we don't want them. Well, then if you don't want them, then why are you yelling at us for not getting more out of Afghanistan? Explain that. Until you do, you can take a back seat.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of that going on. And
we do. And so that's why I think Biden's going to be somewhat politically shielded from this. Okay. And it's going to be a rough couple of weeks. There's no question about it. It doesn't look good, and people don't like to lose, and it just feels bad. That's not the same thing as we remember exactly what happens in 2 weeks. And some folks have said, the real critical thing is the next, not the next Friedman 6 months, but the next 48 hours. Because if you get past tomorrow without other Americans dying, then, that's a big deal in terms of the optics for how the media tells this story. If one more American soldier or Marine or sailor or airman dies, that doesn't change anything about what we just talked about, but media will glom on that as if it's the definitive discussion of Biden's presidency, because every damn thing is the definitive thing about Biden's presidency. Biden goes and he meets the families and the remains of the soldiers coming back, and the soldier, sailor, and the Marines. And he closes his eyes, and he's obviously saying a prayer. And, look at him. He's just so defeated.
Yeah, or he's falling asleep.
He's actually being human and grieving.
Yeah.
That's not defeat.
That was the big game over the weekend, to take those still frames of things and say he's falling asleep, or he's looking at his watch, he's bowing his head.
Hey, the same old BS. Somebody said he was falling asleep with a meeting with Naftali Bennett, and the Israeli press was saying actually he wasn't asleep. He really gave some zingers to Bennett and made Bennett apologize to Obama, which he couldn't have done if he were sleeping through what Bennett was doing.
True. No way to script thing. That's the cottage industry. By the way, they also spent the first part of the weekend just outright circulating on Twitter and elsewhere that Biden hadn't gone to Dover to receive the remains and transfer the remains of these service members. He was there, but they found there's better profit in telling people that he wasn't, and that he's disrespectful of the troops and ought to be impeached as a result. So that turned out to be a small cottage industry over the weekend as well, despite the fact that everybody was able to see. And you're not always able to see images of the president doing that on television or in the media, but there were photos this time, and I don't know what to tell you. They just found it more profitable to say that, for, I guess, click profitable at least, to say, no, he wasn't. And if he was asleep. So neither of those two things apparently true.
Yeah, apparently not. Don't believe everything you read or hear on the radio and the podcast, by the way.
Right, unless it's this one.
Check it out. Do your research.
But don't let it lead you to the feed store.
Right, exactly right.
Okay, unless you have horses. So bring pictures as well. If you really need to get them ivermectin, you must be pissed. But I guess there were people who were angry about there being less hydroxychloroquine available for their malaria treatment as well. So. And other things.
So I'm just looking at some pictures from New Orleans this morning. One of the reasons New Orleans is without power, Brian M. Finger tweets, is because the transmission line that runs across the Mississippi River from Avondale to Harahan had a collapsed tower. The lines are literally in the river.
Yeah, good mix, by the way, electricity and water.
Yeah, that'll go over well.
Yeah, I don't know.
It makes the water warmer.
Well, we don't need any warmer. That's for sure. I also understand,
a bad thing. So,
speaking of the Mississippi River, that the storm surge at some point was so powerful that it ended up briefly reversing the flow of the Mississippi River, which is no mean feat down in New Orleans. Somebody who was reporting on that said it's like 200 feet deep there and half a mile wide or even more. It's an enormous wall of water has to be reversed. And, it's only brief. It's just with all the storm flooding in, and then after everything goes the way it's supposed to. But how they aren't completely flooded, I don't know. Or maybe they'll find out as daylight dawns and they get around a little bit. It may turn out that New Orleans is, in fact, totally flooded. I guess we have to wait and see.
So Jose Andres, the celebrity chef who feeds people, is on the ground in New Orleans. And, hopefully things work out okay. So we're not ignoring the hurricane. It's just that we don't have all the information we need to really know what's going on. And that pretty much is, that's what I said in the Pundit Roundup. It's these three stories. Okay. It's Afghanistan, it's the pandemic, it's the hurricane, and not in any special order. They're all important. And that's pretty much what's going on.
Okay. Well,
so I'll talk to you Wednesday.
Yes, very good. We'll do that.
So what's going on with you?
I got nothing, got a little business to take care of. But, I don't know. I spent the weekend looking at all these things and, the time people were spending doing horrible and wrong things. And it riled me up a little bit. But, I don't know. I guess I'm back on an even keel now. So, best of luck then to those who are on their ground or on their way to help get New Orleans back on their feet. Jose Andres, if you're interested in running for the presidency at any point, let me know. Otherwise, just keep cooking.
Yep.
And we gotta. That guy has just made a whole second career for himself of, being a culinary first responder, if there is such a thing. He's literally running in the opposite direction, going to where the danger is, and feeding the people who are really taking their lives in their hands, trying to rescue folks. So
Chef Jose says he's got 3 kitchens ready with supplies already for 100,000 plus meals, and it's Louisiana cooking, so I bet it's pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you have nothing. Now we will shelter until Ida passes, so, they're ready.
Okay.
They're prepared. They're like FEMA. You pre-position, and then when you need things, you just go in and do it.
Yeah. All right. They won't be picky this weekend, I'm sure, or this week, as take what they can get and be grateful for it. And, the Cajun Navy apparently in full effect as well, doing their private boat rescues of people who are stranded in high water, wherever that may be. Mm-hmm. So we thank them as well. We'll check in with you again on Wednesday. We'll know a lot more about what happened and what didn't there and in Afghanistan. Okay. Thanks, Greg. Talk to you then. All right. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, let's see. Many other things to catch up on here. Let's see. A couple of quick hits, perhaps. I see the news being circulated. I saw it end of last week. We briefly mentioned the number of right-wing figures, radio hosts, activists, other crappy things that people in the right wing might do with their time, who are falling ill with COVID. It was an interesting observation made here at home. My wife was saying, I don't give them credit for much, but I guess you could give right-wing radio hosts and the like who have fallen ill with COVID so seriously that they're hospitalized or die credit for being honest about their approach to vaccine opposition, as opposed to, for instance, there are several other right-wing influencers whom a lot of people believe are lying about their vaccination status and opposing the vaccine and telling people not to get the vaccine when they themselves have been vaccinated. And I guess they're putting their money, lives, everything where their mouths are and saying, I'll be there unvaccinated with all of you and will pay the price if I'm wrong. And I guess that they did. That's an interesting perspective on things as well. They shouldn't be telling people that, but at least they're doing the same thing, I guess. And maybe the fact that that is what they're doing and that the results in their death will change the minds of some small, perhaps, but some percentage of the people who were listening to them before and say, I've been lucky. I haven't gotten COVID yet, but the guy I was listening to said he wasn't going to get it, and then he did, and now he's dead, and maybe I should get that vaccine after all. Counting now among this group, somewhat less famous a figure than some of the right-wing radio hosts, although, quite honestly, I'd never heard of any of them either, but apparently a lot of people had. Here's somebody that you might have heard of, I suppose, if you're following the legal situation, any one of a number of legal situations arising these days. Scott MacFarlane, NBC Washington investigative reporter who has a lot to say on this subject and others, an attorney representing 17 of the U.S. Capitol riot defendants, has fallen ill. He, too, speaking of cottage industry, had clearly made it a cottage industry to represent, he was representing people that were either likely to have this happen to him or he was going to make it happen, turn them into right-wing celebrities and martyrs. And I think that was what was driving him, because he apparently also is or was representing Kyle Rittenhouse, about whom perhaps we'll hear more later on in this week. But anyway, I still want to perhaps revisit that story of what's going on in his life and what he's in control of and what he isn't. But at any rate, John Pierce is his name. John Pierce Esquire, if you like to append that to the names of lawyers, has fallen ill. And apparently, according to a court filing, he's had to file, I guess asking for continuances in some of his cases because he's seriously ill and he can't show up to represent his clients. Per a court filing from federal prosecutors, in this case, Pierce is, quote, is reportedly ill with COVID-19 and on a ventilator and unresponsive. So fairly serious at that, but what are you going to do? MacFarlane continues on and says, per the feds, an associate told the court last week that Pierce had been in an accident when he failed to appear in session. So that's unusual and not going to go very well, I don't think, for his side to lie to the court about why you're not showing up. But he didn't want anybody to know he had COVID, and I can see why, but I mean, duh. Prosecutors also report Pierce had gone quiet on Twitter and that he generally posts multiple messages to Twitter on a daily basis. The Pierce Twitter account referenced by feds has a track record of course, anti-vax and anti-mask mandate tweets. So it should surprise no one that he ends up in the hospital with his COVID. It's almost like it's targeting its victims, but it's not. I mean, it's just almost like that. But okay, it's taking anyone it can get. But the thing is, the irony is that the targeting has been done by these people. They made themselves targets. They painted targets on their backs by refusing vaccine and refusing masks and making sure that everyone around them was being ridiculed if they opted for those things, so that fewer people around them would opt for those things. And the virus has always been interested in eating whatever low-hanging fruit it can get its hands on. If you're otherwise pro-mask and pro-vaccine but have your own reasons for not taking the vaccine, whether it's some sort of medical condition or whatever, you're part of that low-hanging fruit too. It will come and get you, but you are probably isolating yourself the best you can because of that. Anyway, I just thought that was some interesting news. Let's see. Other items in the news include this being tweeted around by Vicky Ward, saying that the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th riot, where John Pierce is defending some of those people, is set to ask for telecommunications companies to preserve the phone records of Donald Trump, members of the Trump family, and Republican members of Congress who played some role in the Stop the Steal rally. The list of members of Congress, allegedly, whose records are, the list of members of Congress, they are members of Congress. Their records are allegedly being requested. That list is said to include Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, Jim Jordan, naturally, Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar, all the names you know and acknowledge as members of Congress that you don't like very much. Mo Brooks, Madison Cawthorn, Matt Gaetz, Louis Gohmert, Jody Heiss, and Scott Perry, to the surprise of very few of us, I am sure. Speaking of Jim Jordan, at least, I happened to see this news picked up, I think, by Raw Story out of a Politico, one of their dispatches that has many topics in it. But the Raw Story folks distilled it down to the important part. Jim Jordan now admits that he spoke with Trump multiple times during the Capitol siege. When we last left this story, he was no longer denying that he had spoken with the president possibly multiple times. He just couldn't be sure. I spoke with President Trump all the time, so often that I just can't be sure how many times I spoke to him in the middle of maybe the biggest event of my political life, but whatever. But it's sounding more and more like, he knows, and he knows that we know that he spoke to Trump multiple times during the insurrection. And basically, in an attempt to make himself look good, I guess, it's very interesting. And there's a lot of dynamics swirling around this thing. And I think Josh Marshall also noted somewhere along the line that, all these Republicans, I guess, now that it's come to investigation of all this stuff, are doing their best to say, I tried to do the right thing and tried to get the attacks called off. Yes, I spoke to President Trump. And what I spoke to him about, to the extent I'll tell you, because the other excuse is, I won't reveal the contents of my conversations with the president. Why, that's privileged in some way. They're trying to hint that it's privileged in some way, but it isn't. They're just trying to say, I refuse to divulge that information because every conversation I have with the president is super important and about national security, which isn't true. But they're trying to make it, trying to put out the story that, I called him and told him, we got to have you call this thing off. Speak to your supporters and make them stop all of this. Which, that may or may not work to clear their name in some way. But it also means that a lot of the things that they've said along the way from January 6th on have been lies or at the minimum misleading. And it also puts them in trouble with Trump world, which to this point they've been willing to do almost anything to avoid. It also belies, of course, the whole thing about, it was Antifa dressed as Trump supporters. They called the president and told him, you got to get your supporters to stop doing this, which one is an acknowledgement that it was his supporters doing it. And two, they didn't make any calls to Antifa headquarters or whatever the hell you would, whatever the hell you'd try to call to try to get Antifa to stop, because there was no way in hell then or now or in any time in between that they really thought that Antifa was responsible for these attacks. It also pulls in some more names. Let me read through the Raw Story report real quick. Jim Jordan now admitting he spoke with Trump multiple times during the Capitol siege, according to the report, and I think that report was from Politico, while still pleading ignorance over what transpired when he spoke with Donald Trump on January 6th. As the U.S. Capitol was under siege, Representative Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, of course, confessed to a Politico reporter, that he probably had multiple talks with the president that day instead of just one. In July, Jordan claimed, quote, I spoke with him that day after. I don't know if I spoke with him in the morning or not. I just don't know. I don't know when those conversations happened, reported Rolling Stone. According to Politico's Olivia Beavers, the Ohio conservative is altering his story on the heels of the House Select Committee on January 6th insurrection, asking phone companies for records of phone calls during that day, including those involving lawmakers. Politico's Playbook is reporting, quote, look, I definitely spoke to the president that day. I don't recall. I know it was more than once. Ta-da. I just don't recall the times, Jordan explained when pressed. Jordan had previously disclosed that he spoke to Trump on January 6th, but not the existence of more than one call on the day, a rare piece of new information on the former president's moves during the riot At a time when House Republicans are loath to discuss such specifics, the report states, Trump-Jordan discussions are likely to be of keen interest to the Democrat-led Select Committee on January 6th, which is expected to soon seek phone records of members of Congress themselves in its probe. By the way, this should bring back to mind for you the inappropriateness of Kevin McCarthy's insistence that Jim Jordan ought to be on that committee. He is, in fact, a material witness and maybe a major player in all of the actions of January 6th, and it would be ridiculous to think that he deserved a seat from which he could manipulate the availability, interpretation, or dissemination of that evidence against him. It would be a little stupid, don't you think? But that didn't stop him from pitching a fit over it anyway, both McCarthy and Jordan, then and now. Let's see, I got some messages here. Greg was saying, by the way, all of those pitches to the media. I was on the phone with the president trying to get him to make the people stop is, of course, an attempt to throw Trump under the bus. So, as Greg puts it, I told him to stop. It didn't stop. What does that mean? Well, it means a number of things, including you have no influence anywhere in Washington. My understanding is, I guess if we follow I think that's the end of the Raw Story article, but I must have clicked through to the Politico article and read that because I'm pretty sure I saw somewhere in the reporting that Matt Gaetz was also involved and actually got himself involved in these calls to the president. And again, of interest, when it endangered them, either physically endangered them or politically endangered them, Republicans knew just where to go to try to get the attack stopped. But, as Greg points out, it didn't work. So I suppose the Trump people could say, well, see, it wasn't our supporters, because if you called me and asked me to make it stop, and I like you, I will make it stop because I have total power over everything, including these people. Even though, by the way, they just recently booed me when I told them that the vaccines were a good idea. But other than those two instances, they're totally in my control because I'm a very powerful person. I very strongly told them to stop. Here's the scoop in the Politico playbook. More than one January 6th Trump-Jordan call. We know that Donald Trump and Jim Jordan spoke once on the day of the Capitol riot, but the Ohio Republican has said he doesn't remember when their conversations took place. We now have some new details that could help clear up that time frame, including confirmation of at least one more phone conversation between Jordan and the then president during the siege. After a group of lawmakers were evacuated from the House chamber to a safe room on January 6th, Jordan was joined by, there it is, Representative Matt Gaetz, pervert of Florida, for a call during which they implored Trump to tell his supporters to stand down, per a source with knowledge of that call. Interesting. So it's either one of them or someone who was nearby, a staffer, another member, I don't know. The source declined to say how Trump responded to this request, although, we know how he responded in the real world. He didn't actually call off his supporters, although eventually he should go home, you're very special, everyone loves you, right? Jordan, when asked about whether Gaetz participated, said he'd have to think about it, citing many conversations that he had during the frenetic attack. He also said phone calls to Trump happened more than once on that deadly day. Look, I definitely spoke to the president that day. I don't recall. I don't know. I know it was more than once. I just don't recall the times. Jordan told Olivia Beavers, we mentioned that. He later said, I'm sure one of the Trump-involved calls took place in the safe room because we were in that room forever. For safety reasons, they note here that they're not disclosing the specific room where members were evacuated to, but that is the room Jordan is referencing. Jordan would not get into specifics of what was discussed with the president, though he said that, like everyone, he wanted the National Guard to get involved. A spokesperson for Gaetz, who has supported Trump's decisions on January 6th, said Congressman Gaetz speaks with President Trump regularly and doesn't disclose the substance of those discussions with the media. Jordan has previously disclosed that he spoke to Trump on January 6th, but not the existence of more than one call in the day. Rare piece of new information. We referenced that in reading from Raw Story. Likely to be of keen interest to the committee, of course. And yeah, I guess that's kind of where it ends. So, all right, that is something of a new development, and we'll try and keep an eye on that. It'll be fun to watch, and that new information about who else is having their phone conversations or having the information about their conversations and phone calls subpoenaed. Also very interesting. I think they're on the right track. All right, what else have we got here? I'm going to have to spend some time offline trying to figure out, unless somebody wants to call in or do a segment about what the hell's going on over. Something happened. ESPN aired a high school football game between, I guess, some of the top teams in the country, and I don't know. It seems like the school is apparently maybe a fake school or something like that. I can't figure out what's going on here, but I am not going to embroil myself just yet in an ESPN controversy, but just seems weird. I acknowledge that a lot of people are taking up a lot of bandwidth talking about that, and that seems odd. But if you know what the hell's going on, let us know. All right. Let's see. In other weird parts of the world, a story from out of Pennsylvania that as we wait for the horrific mess that is the Arizona fake audit fraud to wind down, I guess, and offer their report. Remember that their report to the Republican-controlled Arizona State Senate is delayed because all of the cyber ninjas have COVID. That'll be interesting to see what happens with them as well. There have been threats all along that other states have been interested in pushing audits of the, fake audits just like Arizona. But so far we've been able to hold all of these things off. And I'm wondering, this story seems to suggest that maybe the levee is going to break here. Will an election, quote, audit happen in Pennsylvania? That was one of the states where people have been pushing for it. Mark Levy of the Associated Press writes this story. It appears in where are they based? Allentown Morning Call. It's a Lehigh Valley paper, but I guess, datelined here is Harrisburg, but still, I think it's, like I said, Easton, Allentown, Bethlehem area, I think is the big circulation center for the Morning Call, if I recall correctly. Nearly 10 months. That's important. It's been 10 months after last year's election. Pennsylvania's state lawmakers can seemingly no longer avoid pressure to mount an Arizona-style, quote, audit of the 2020 election, stoked by former President Donald Trump's persistent and baseless claims that the election was rigged against him. Even 10 months down the road, we're not clear from this. The Senate's top Republican, President Pro Tem Jake Corman, came out in recent days and threw his support behind a, quote, full forensic investigation, unquote, after weeks of silence about it and discord among Senate Republicans over efforts by one senator to drag the state into one. At the same time, Corman and that senator, Doug Mastriano, a Trump loyalist, took to the live streams of right-wing broadcasters to accuse each other of being the true obstacle to an audit and claim the mantle of being the true champion for an audit. Great. Well, I think they probably ought to keep that up. Corman had previously been dismissive of it, saying in June that, quote, we don't need to relitigate 2020, even as Trump bashed Corman as fighting an audit, quote, as though he were a radical left Democrat, which he most assuredly is not. Corman and many other Republican state lawmakers had avoided the subject by pointing to hearings they held, reports they produced, and legislation they drafted to, in their view, fix Pennsylvania's election law, but it had not satisfied enough Republican voters, apparently. In any case, Arizona's, quote, audit does not even remotely resemble any kind of audit that is accepted by the election administration community. The The Associated Press takes a closer look at what is going on. All right. Well, so far they're at least explaining it correctly. So let's continue on. The driving force behind the movement is to investigate claims by Trump and others that the election was stolen, with backers saying many people don't trust that the election was fair. Indeed, polls have shown a majority of Republicans don't trust the election result. Democrats say an audit is simply a stunt to erode the legitimacy of President Joe Biden's victory. He won Pennsylvania by more than 80,000 votes, according to certified results. And they blame Trump and Republicans for spreading lies about the election that have sown distrust among voters. The state's attorney general, Democrat Josh Shapiro, called it a, quote, partisan fishing expedition, and has vowed to fight it, while Democratic Governor Tom Wolf's top elections officials threatened to decertify any state-certified election equipment that gets examined by third parties. So there will be costs involved for localities that defy all of this and say, well, we're going to have a forensic investigation of our voting equipment and give it to cyber ninjas. Hand it over to a third party, and it's going to be decertified, and you're going to have to start all over again and buy a new one. The state Republican Party is trying to fundraise off an audit, questioning what Democrats have to hide, while the state Democratic Party accuses Republicans of wasting time and money appeasing far-right insurrectionists. Most Republican senators generally avoid repeating Trump's baseless election claims, but they nevertheless perpetuate the idea that Democrats cheated by distorting the actions of Democratic state judges and officials leading up to last year's election as unconstitutional or illegal, which they're not. Still, critics inside the Senate Republican caucus suggest that people who want the audit are only interested in seeing Trump reinstated. Okay. Well, that's really what they're after. Election administrators say an audit is duplicative, given the required audits already carried out by the county and the state. Meanwhile, Trump's false claims of a stolen election have been debunked by the courts, his own Justice Department, and numerous recounts, and no prosecutor, judge, or election official in Pennsylvania has raised a concern about widespread fraud. What would an audit look like? The blueprint for Trump allies is the widely discredited and partisan, quote, audit mounted by the Senate Republicans in Arizona, where they subpoenaed voting machines and ballots in heavily populated Maricopa County. On July 7th, Mastriano threatened to subpoena Philadelphia, a Democratic bastion that has been the target of Republican claims about voting fraud, and York and Tioga counties for similar access to voting machines, ballots, computers, documents, and more. However, Corman said Mastriano issued those demands without the approval of the Senate Republican caucus, and in recent days stripped Mastriano of his authority and handed it off to a different caucus member. On Monday, Corman told a pro-Trump show host that the Senate, quote, can bring people in. We can put them under oath, right? We can subpoena records, and that's what we need to do, and that's what we're going to do. He also has said Senate Republicans want access to voting machines, and they will go to court to help secure that access. Corman also suggested that ballots would be compared to lists of who voted, while seemingly giving credence to right-wing conspiracy theories that dead people voted. We need to get the voter rolls. We need to get the ballots, things of that nature, so we can match them up to see who voted, where they were living, were they alive, all those sorts of things, Corman said on the pro-Trump Wendy Bell radio program. Wendy, be careful. You're a pro-Trump radio host. You might die of COVID if you don't watch out. When will it start? I mean, maybe she's vaccinated. Then you won't. Corman has said hearings would begin this past week. But I guess they haven't yet. That didn't happen. There you go. There's the answer. Meanwhile, many questions remain unanswered about who will do the work, how will it be funded, and where such a vast amount of documents and equipment will be stored. Corman seems determined to avoid the pitfalls of Arizona's Senate Republicans. No, he doesn't. Namely, funding it with more than $5.7 million in private donations raised by Trump allies during hiring a cybersecurity firm with no election experience and led by a Trump supporter who has questioned the legitimacy of Biden's victory. But I bet he won't avoid any of those pitfalls. Senate Republican officials say they want credible auditors, such as an international firm with experience in elections, and believe funding it with private money is legally questionable. It is. That's good to believe, but then you have to follow through. The only money that they may be able to find is cash from a massive reserve Pennsylvania's legislature has maintained for years, managed in secret, with no rules over how it can be used. The Senate alone last year reported $66 million in its reserve account. Well, I guess they could try and use that. I don't know how well that'll go over with the public. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/Kagro X gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We continue with the write-up from the Associated Press, printed in the Morning Call of Allentown, Pennsylvania, on the question of what the hell's wrong with Pennsylvania. That is to say, the Republican conference, caucus, what have you, in the state Senate, unable, as it seems, to withstand public pressure to try and launch an Arizona-style fake audit in Pennsylvania. So when we left off, we found out that they actually had a $66 million reserve account that they could use, theoretically, to pay for this audit, which I guess would be public funds just sort of squirreled away over the years through the appropriations process. But at least that might help them avoid the pitfall of using privately donated money for what should ostensibly be a public function. If there were a legitimate audit of the vote in Arizona, it would have been publicly funded and handled by officialdom, not by outside contractors with no experience. So, how is this being received is the next question addressed by this piece. Some hardcore supporters of an audit are unhappy over Mastriano's ouster and remain unconvinced by Corman's conversion, labeling him Jake the Snake, while rooting for a primary challenger to beat him next May. So this is a Republicans in disarray story at heart. Others seem comfortable with the anointing of a new leader of the effort, Senator Chris Dush, D-U-S-H, Dush, like duh, but with an S before the H, who has said he has doubts about the election result and embraced Arizona's audit in June when he visited to see it up close. So you knew that when they went and did that, they were going to come back and try and do the same thing. Now it looks like they might get their way. Corman said he has been in touch with Trump and that Trump seems to be, quote, comfortable with where we're heading, because they're heading where he wants them to. That's why he's comfortable. Perhaps the most important audience is Trump himself, and he has been officially silent about it. Could the election in Pennsylvania be overturned? No, but here's the section on it. Corman maintains that the aim of the audit is to find out the truth about last year's election and use it to ensure future elections are fair. The Senate, he says, has no authority to overturn an election, but if our work leads to someone else taking that work into a court of law and changing those results, then so be it. If Pennsylvania's electors were somehow switched to Trump, Biden would still have enough electoral votes from other states to have prevailed in last year's election. In any case, numerous federal and state courts have already thrown out lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies, while most people are not aware of the safety procedures around casting a ballot in Pennsylvania, said Larry Otter, a lawyer who specializes in election law. The possibility of finding a mammoth fraud on a statewide basis is zero, Otter said. This is a colossal waste of taxpayer money. So, okay, I think we knew that that's how that would end up, but it was gratifying to hear it actually conclude that way. That is nice. Other items for inclusion in today's show, well, let's see. There's a lot. Let me click through to see how some of these things are going. Oh, yes. There was information on one of, I guess, the latest of the right-wing radio hosts to die of COVID. His name was Mark Bernier. I don't know whether he says Bernier. I don't know. Bernier. And it was of some interest that, our Twitter friend, that guy, yes, that guy. He didn't want to be that guy, but he is that guy. But he's that guy 3002, in case you want to find which, the correct that guy among the apparently 3,001 others. I don't know what the 3002 actually means, but hey. But he set it up as one of those how it started, how it's going memes, because it deserved to be that way. Because at some point, Nikki Fried, and it's Nikki Fried is it Florida, what is she? I forget which office she currently occupies, but statewide office in Florida, I guess the only statewide elected official in Florida who's a Democrat, now running for governor to unseat Ron DeSantis, right? Nikki Fried had tweeted back on July 29th, about a month ago, "The greatest generation had to defeat the Nazis to preserve our way of life. You're only being asked to get a shot. Not get shot, but get a shot. So be a patriot. Turn off the TV and go get vaccinated," she says in this TV spot, and she tweeted it around. Mark Bernier's reaction to this, he tweets, "It should say, now the U.S. government is acting like Nazis. Get the shot." Except, of course, by the way, I don't know whether he did this on purpose or whether it was sometimes autocorrect does this, but he apostrophe S's the Nazis, makes it possessive. So U.S. is acting like Nazis something. Nazis underwear, extra underwear for the hurricane. I don't know. Not really sure what he's trying to say, except that the government is a bunch of Nazis for asking you to get the shot. And anyway, that's how it started. And how's it going? And 1 month later, after a 3-week COVID-19 battle, Daytona Beach talk radio host Mark Bernier dies. So that's how it goes. And also of some interest, I did see our good friend Scott Charles of Philadelphia tweeting about that guy way back, not our friend that guy, but about Mark Bernier being that guy this time. And his announcement that he had contracted COVID after being a mask denialist, vaccine, anti-vaxxer, anti-mask, etc. And, making some comment. I could probably find it if I scroll enough to come up with it. Now I feel obligated to do that. But, maybe I can do it here, but it's going to be a while. But he said, I think he actually said something about, you caught yourself the F around and find out virus strain. And now we're about to see how it's going to go. Anyway, I guess either a Mark Bernier fan or somebody who just felt compelled to defend him for whatever reason stepped in and said, he'll live and he'll be fine and he'll live his life just like we all should be doing. We shouldn't be scared of this virus and live in fear and yada, yada, yada. Well, anyway, as it turns out, he did not live. He didn't make it. And that guy is totally wrong. I mean, it was just a stab in the dark to guess that he was going to survive, but it wasn't a particularly good one. The Delta variant is very powerful. And if you are unvaccinated, you're not only likely to get it, you're likely to do a lot worse in the hospital when you do get it than was the case under the, I guess, the ancestral strain of the virus. It just isn't going well for them. Yeah, here it is. Scott Charles tweeting the F around and find out variant now accounts for 90% of all conservative talk show host infections. Please get vaccinated. He's answered by, some trollish person with the Pepe, the frog avatar. He will survive and live life. That's what we all will do. Stop living in fear and live your life. Well, he didn't. I mean, he did stop living in fear, but he didn't live his life. And as I was saying about that, I mean, that thread didn't, that answer doesn't go well. And you know how they say on Twitter, this did not age well. And the only thing that aged worse than that tweet, of course, was Mark Bernier himself, who aged only a month. But imagine trying to, I mean, if you had the prescience, and somehow knew what the outcome was going to be, imagine how they would have laughed at you and scoffed if you had said, don't take this lightly. He could be dead within a month. Oh, give me a break. How dare you? And that would be the appropriate answer, of course, if somebody announces they have COVID and you show up and say he'll be dead in a month. That's not very nice. But, it's true. It's just sort of an interesting dynamic to this whole thing. Like, you might be dead in a month, and I don't think you're taking it seriously. All right, let's see. Among other things that probably deserve some mention, there are many. Along with Governor DeSantis in Florida finding out that, at least at the trial level, a local or maybe federal judge, but still locally based, blocked his order purporting to ban mask mandates at the municipal or county level. Similarly, a judge has stepped in and done the same with respect to Texas Governor Greg Abbott's mask mandate ban. A judge allows mandates in Travis County schools, and Paxton appeal blocks the order. But let's catch up on what happened. We mentioned the Florida thing, I think, at the end of last week. Now in Texas, let me clear that up here. Chuck Lindell, writing at the Austin American-Statesman, judge allows mask mandates in Travis County School. Paxton appeal blocks order. Which order? Let's find out. Concluding that Governor Greg Abbott exceeded his authority by banning mask mandates in Texas. And that's the same basis of the decision in Florida, that he exceeded his authority, which, by the way, every time a Republican says a Democrat like Joe Biden has exceeded his authority with things or threatens to exceed his authority, they say tyranny. I mean, that's what exceeding your authority is. I guess, well, it's that plus ignoring admonitions to stop and not exceed your authority would really be closer to tyranny. But anyway, concluding that he had exceeded his authority by banning mask mandates in Texas, an Austin judge ruled Friday that school districts in Travis County can enforce face coverings as a COVID-19 precaution. State District Judge Catherine Mauzy's, M-A-U-Z-Y, Mauzy's order also applied to 19 school districts that represent about 1 million students, including Austin, Dallas, El Paso, Fort Worth, and Houston, as well as Austin Community College, which also sued Abbott. However, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton quickly appealed automatically, blocking enforcement of Mauzy's temporary injunction, though the Austin-based Third Court of Appeals can be asked to reinstate the judge's order while Paxton's challenge proceeds. In her ruling, Mauzy concluded Abbott's ban on mandatory masks, contained in a July 29th executive order, was unlawful and exceeded his authority in violation of the Texas Constitution. Mauzy found that The school officials and parents who challenged Abbott's order made a sufficient showing to establish that Abbott was not authorized to declare by executive fiat that the school districts are prohibited from requiring masks to be worn. Without court intervention, Mousy added, Abbott's ban leaves school officials unable to mandate masks to control the spread of COVID-19, which threatens to overwhelm public schools and could result in more extreme measures, such as school closures that have already begun in several Texas school districts. In a separate ruling, Mousy also granted an injunction sought by Harris County to allow a mask mandate to continue for Houston area schools, said Christian Menifee, county attorney. Governor Abbott is misusing the Texas Disaster Act to make this pandemic worse, Menifee said, calling the ruling an important step in reining in the governor. But in a third challenge, the judge declined to issue a statewide injunction requested by the Southern Center for Child Advocacy that would have allowed mask mandates in all Texas school districts. Mousy's one-page order gave no reason for the denial. Abbott had argued that Texans, well-versed in taking protective steps during a long pandemic, should be trusted with making their own health decisions, not have behavior dictated by the government. But officials in numerous school districts across Texas have defied the governor's order, arguing that the highly contagious Delta variant of the coronavirus is threatening to overwhelm hospitals with pediatric patients in numbers not seen during previous spikes in the pandemic. And we started the show with talking about the troubles that Texas is having keeping its other citizens alive when it would ordinarily have been entirely possible to do so now that the ICUs have been flooded with COVID patients. For a virus transmitted by respiratory droplets, which it really kind of isn't, I think it's airborne aerosols more so than respiratory droplets could probably do it also, but masks protect infected wearers from spreading COVID-19 and can capture droplets before they can be inhaled by healthy students. Health experts testified at hearings before Mousy earlier this week. Masks also offer the best form of protection for students under age 12 who are not eligible for COVID-19 vaccinations, but are being asked to congregate in classrooms, hallways, and lunchrooms where social distancing is not always possible, the experts testified. Lawyers for Paxton argued that the governor's emergency authority gives Abbott's executive order force and effect of a state law during the pandemic. They also said Abbott is allowed to take other factors into account, such as economic recovery, when issuing pandemic safety orders. I'm vaguely remembering here somewhere, maybe it's stuck in pocket somewhere, that part of Abbott's order was contingent on some aspect of our knowledge of the pandemic, which is no longer operative. And it may be that it was focusing on, I don't know whether it had anything to do with the mask mandate one or maybe just a separate one on vaccines, but the whole thing hinged on the vaccine being, at the time of the issuance of his order, unapproved officially by the FDA. Now, of course, it is officially approved by the FDA, and that might wipe out part of his orders all by itself, though I might be confusing more than one separate order. But at any rate, I'll see if I can dig that up and clarify things. I'm glad this is happening because even here in Virginia, where we supposedly are taking great care to, all get vaccinated and everything. The kids in my son's high school are, mostly, I assume, vaccinated. He's vaccinated. They're all wearing masks. We're pretty compliant with things here. But it really feels like and this might be exactly what happened, we prepared for this school year by drawing up plans in June and July for bringing kids back to school. And that was at the time, remember those golden few weeks where they were like, well, if you're vaccinated, then you don't need to wear a mask when you're indoors. And certainly not when you're outdoors either. But we were all sort of given a green light. Yeah, vaccinated people can congregate indoors again unmasked. And that changed with the growth of the Delta variant. And now, of course, they say, well, we should be masked indoors again because of the Delta variant. But the plans for resuming school I mean, they then just said, well, we'll add masks back into the routine. But as my son has come back and reported, he's basically said the cafeteria is going to kill us all. I mean, it's not, because they're vaccinated, and it won't kill any of the vaccinated kids, thank God. At least I hope not. I mean, who knows what kind of other variants we could give rise to if we keep this nonsense up. And I hate to say that the schools ought to be closed again, because it's very, very tough. And as I recall, our school district actually gave us an option early on to say, well, we're just going to opt out of in-person schooling again and take remote schooling. And I guess that was for people who are, immune compromised and have very other, but I guess they didn't ask you to prove it. So, I mean, it was out there, but we opted, in June and July when it looked a hell of a lot better, he should get back to school. Now, of course, it's looking worse. And with anecdotes, being reported from all over the place about the rapidity with which this Delta virus can spread. I read something over the weekend from a professor, I think at Florida State it was, who was complaining that, rightly so, but saying, look, I'm fully vaccinated. I wear my mask. I wear an N95 mask. 100% of the students in my class were masked. Once I gave out masks to people who showed up without them, but I gave them KN95 masks. We were all masked. I've taught 2 classes. I think he said there were both around 20 students in each of the classes. He was in the classroom for 2.5 hours, and he's COVID positive already. 2 classes, vaccinated, masked, all the students wearing masks. Didn't matter. I mean, I guess you could say, well, he might have picked it up elsewhere, not necessarily from the classroom. That has to be acknowledged as a possibility. But my son was saying, we're jam-packed into the cafeteria, just like we always were pre-COVID days. And they split up the lunch into several different sessions, but that was always the case, too. They didn't have enough seats for all the kids. But that just means that each session of the lunch there is jam-packed, and they are sitting shoulder to shoulder at regular lunch tables, masks off. And the masks apparently come off the minute the kids get into the cafeteria. Not that it would make very much difference, but the kids who were waiting in line to buy lunch, masks off, because we're about to have our lunch. We're going to have our masks off anyway. I mean, you could encourage them, should encourage them to keep your masks on until you eat. And when we were recently on a plane, they were saying, well, you should keep your mask on even when you're eating. They basically said just lower it briefly to just actually put food or drink in your mouth and then put the mask back on. They wanted us to do that. You're never going to get compliance with that, I'm sure, in a high school cafeteria. But the major story is hundreds of kids in 4 different lunch sessions, shoulder to shoulder, eating. If there's unvaccinated people in there and there's Delta in there, they're getting it. So he came home and said, I don't know, maybe we'll be in school 2 months before they have us back out, which might have been a better prediction a couple of months ago, when we were worried about flu season and traditional flu and cold season being augmented by coronavirus. But yeah, and also in my discussions with my brother about what's going on, the one who's a doctor, he said, by the way, 2 weeks is more likely than 2 months. So yeah, that and a report from the dining hall at college from my college-age son, same thing, and how he showed up to get his meals there and was like, oh my effing God, what's going on in here? It's shoulder to shoulder, as it always was pre-COVID, but that changed his plan. He went in, and you can still get your food to go, and that's what he did. Unfortunately, he lives a 10-minute walk from the dining hall, so it's a 10-minute walk, and it's hot and humid still. 10-minute walk to get the food, pick up your food, take it to go, 10 minutes walk home. So by that time, you're steaming, food's cold. But might be what he needs to do in order to protect himself as best he can. The schools are going to fail this thing. I think they prepared to fight the last war and figured that vaccinated kids could do this indoors with their cloth masks, and it appears that they cannot. We will only learn this a little later, but that, I believe, is what we're going to learn. Sorry, everybody. We're going to end up closing those schools again probably pretty soon. All right. Let's see. A couple of other interesting items that we can squeeze in here. Lots of complaints over the weekend for the New York Times profile of the pandemic in Florida. Still making it a little too easy, still feathering the nest for Ron DeSantis for some reason. And the big follow-up to Politico's how Ron DeSantis won the pandemic story in the New York Times, even when they are running it under the title of What Went Wrong with the Pandemic in Florida, they apparently get it wrong. I didn't get a chance to read the article, perhaps something we can dive into later this week, but I think it was well covered on Twitter, lots of people complaining, because apparently they still credit Ron DeSantis with, well, it was a strong push to get people vaccinated, and people, who have observed this thing inside of Florida and out, saying, you might not really mean that. There was no strong push. It's been months since the governor, 4 months, I think people said, since he did anything, overt pushing vaccination. And even then, it was a very light touch, and he has instead spent most of his time bragging about standing up Regeneron dispensaries, essentially, and not getting people actively vaccinated. So that's been of some interest as well. And it's just been wild to watch, to say the very least. All right, let me see if I can jump back into grab something that we can insert in the last minute or so from out of pocket. That of some interest too. Well, we'll have to give some more thought to this. Let's throw this one in here. Just for fun, from The Hill, legal experts welcome sanctions of pro-Trump lawyers and say more are needed. John Krusel writing for The Hill here. Attorneys behind some of the dubious litigation over former President Trump's 2020 election loss were sanctioned this week, that being last week, by a federal judge in a move that was welcomed by legal ethics experts and me. More disciplinary steps are needed to deter efforts to undermine future U.S. elections, said experts who spoke to The Hill, adding that the system for holding pro-Trump election lawyers to account was working as it should. Should be a little faster maybe, but the wheels of ethical accountability grind slowly but deliberately, said Bradley Moss, a national security lawyer. Within the span of 10 months, we have seen both state bars and the courts take action against those lawyers who took their propagation of Trump's conspiratorial fantasies out of the cable news studio and into the courtroom. Following President Biden's win at the ballot box, pro-Trump attorneys filed dozens of lawsuits based on unfounded claims contesting the election's legitimacy. The litigation persisted even after the attorneys collectively racked up an abysmal record in court, winning only a single minor case while losing some 60 others. Although some Trump-allied attorneys characterized their actions as hard-fought advocacy, critics say they crossed an ethical red line by deploying politically motivated disinformation to advance Trump's big lie that the election was stolen from him. Concerns about holding pro-Trump lawyers accountable for baseless election litigation have grown more pressing in light of fears that the 2024 presidential election could see even more sophisticated efforts to use the courts to subvert the results. Several legal ethics experts said appropriate punishment should include years-long suspensions from legal practice and even disbarment. Lawyers who file baseless lawsuits for propaganda purposes are engaging in fraud on the public and harming our democratic institutions, said Barbara McQuaid, federal prosecutor during the Obama administration, who's now a law professor at the University of Michigan. For that reason, strong sanctions are needed to deter lawyers from enabling a weaponization of false information. The fresh round of punishment came this week when a federal judge in Michigan sanctioned 9 pro-Trump attorneys, this would be last week, saying their lawsuit over the former president's 2020 election defeat amounted to a historic and profound abuse of the judicial process. This case was never about fraud. It was about undermining the people's faith in our democracy and debasing the judicial process to do so, wrote Judge Linda Parker, an Obama appointee on the federal district court in Detroit. The sanctions were levied against some of the higher-profile Trump lawyers, including Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood. whom Parker ordered to pay the legal fees of their opposing parties and referred to state bar authorities for further discipline. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer is one of the defendants in the case, who asked the courts to impose disciplinary action, and she praised the outcome on Wednesday. While the mob on January 6th physically assaulted our democracy, Sidney Powell and other lawyers continue to do so in our courts. They launched dozens of lawsuits exploiting the legal system to undermine a free and fair election. The courts rejected all of them. Today's ruling sends a clear message. Those who seek to overturn an American election and poison the well of American democracy will face consequences. Wow. Okay. There are others who agree with the whole thing. Another Trump attorney to come under disciplinary action for pushing 2020 election lies was Rudy Giuliani, whose law licenses in New York and Washington, D.C. have been suspended as a result. The Powell and Giuliani didn't respond to requests for comment. Who cares? They deserved it. There's a little bit more. You might want to read through it, but it's time now for us to pack up and go. Leave the microphone to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next. We are off the air live tomorrow. Of course, my father-in-law's funeral draws us away, so we'll be rejoining you live on Wednesday. Not sure what kind of programming I'll be able to line up between then and now. Depends on how my day goes in between then and now. But I know how the next hour is going to go. The West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And the information he's got for you, always a blockbuster. How about this? The only way South Dakota Attorney General avoided prison and stayed out of office after fatally hitting a pedestrian.
NetworksRadio.com.
It's because he's a Republican.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
There's more, of course. After constant threats of physical violence by white nationalist anti-vaxxers, school board members across the nation are calling it quits. And despite CDC warnings that COVID-19 is a virus and not a parasite, an Ohio judge ordered a hospital to treat an unvaccinated COVID-19 patient with that horse dewormer that you all heard about. Stay tuned.